Hello and welcome to today's Fireside Chat on Girls' Education from Priority to Reality. My name is Rashan Hajira and I'm joined by Sabina Abbasi and Zuriel Oduwole, and we're going to be talking about how we change girls' education today from just being a priority that's talked about to an actual reality lived by girls across the world. I'm going to give a moment to our speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into the questions. Zuriel, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Zuriel Oduwole. I'm from Los Angeles, California. I'm a 19-year-old filmmaker, girl education advocate, and presidential advisor. Then when I'm not too busy, I do a little work with climate change on the side as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
So you must have a lot of free time on your agenda.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Zuriel. Sabina, what about you?
Right, thank you so much. I'm Sabina, I'm from Pakistan. I work in an organization called Talimabad, where we create animated content for students. Currently, we have a library of over 700 videos, which has a reach of around 10 million users all across Pakistan. And we were also working with schools in enabling them to convert into the digital space and empowering them in using the lesson plans and teacher training.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sabina. So we have a packed agenda of questions today, and I'm going to be asking both of you a few different ones. So to start us off, Sabina, do you want to talk about some of the main challenges that might be preventing girls from acquiring education, and what can we do to change that?
Right. I think we have talked about multiple challenges, but I just want to specifically talk about one of the experiences that I had in a rural town of Pakistan where literacy levels were extremely low. And what we did was we, in collaboration with Malala Fund, we handed over 200 tablets to these girls who were out of school and they dropped out after primary. And it had, again, that animated content with local context and relevant to these girls. What we saw was that most of these girls came back to school. They completed their entire course, and 100% of them gave the exams, and then 92% of them actually passed the exams as well. I also met their parents, specifically mothers, and they were asking for more content. So that was a kind of a surprise, because there's a myth that parents are not aware because they're illiterate, and that wasn't the case, at least in this community, where, again, the literacy levels were the lowest in Pakistan. So that's when I realized that the issue is high-quality content, which is not available to them. And again, another issue was accessibility. In that area, there was no secondary school within the reach of these parents, because, again, in certain areas, there is a security issue, and parents are not comfortable in sending their daughters to far schools. So I think we need to realize that it's not, at the end of the day, about awareness. It's about providing high-quality education to these girls, and we have to be very creative about it as well. If, for example, if traditional schooling won't work, if you have 22 million children out of school, you cannot possibly create that many schools. Be creative with that. Like, for example, our content is being distributed through app, through broadcast, through radio. So there are multiple mediums through which you can actually reach to these students who are eager to learn, who have so many aspirations and hopes. So yeah, I think if we just focus on that might have a lot of solutions over that.
So accessibility, you would say, is one of the main challenges that we're seeing right now. And when it comes to content, we found that it's not the desire that's missing, it's the actual piece of content that people need. Now, Zuriel, do you consider, when it comes to content, there is that element of representation there? Do you consider girls' and women's leadership and representation being integral to solving the problem?
Wow, I think that's an incredible question. And it gives me the opportunity to talk about something that I started a couple years ago before the whole world shut down. I think if we all take a moment to think about it, over the last 50 years, whenever you've heard about girls' education, almost always you're hearing about it from adults, or adults are the ones that are driving it, not girls. And what I found out is this creates an agenda disconnect in many global settings, most of which are dominated by men. Because what happens is they're seeing women in their 30s, 40s, 50s, sometimes even 60s, talking about girls' education. And so they don't understand that. It's a huge disconnect. It'd be like if you had a group of teenagers protesting outside of a car manufacturing company, right? And advocating for overtime for the adults that work inside. It's a huge disconnect. But then I want us to think about and imagine if teenage girls, right, were on the global stage and fighting and making the case for girls' education by themselves. I mean, that's what I've been doing for the last almost 9 years now. An example, that's what I wanted to talk about when you said that question, actually, is in Mozambique. I met with President Felipe Nyusi in Maputo. This was back in 2018. And basically, I was talking to him, and we had a very extensive conversation about the importance of girls' education in his country. So we were talking, and I talked to him about the things that I did as well as an educated girl. I wanted to show him an example of what girls could do if they're educated. And I even also added my voice to the issue of girl marriage in the country, because Mozambique had one of the highest rates of girl marriage, according to UNICEF. And then just, I think it was 16 months after that first meeting, so this is July of 2019 now, Mozambique formally outlawed girl marriage in the country. Because when we talked about it, I said, look, this practice of girl marriage, it's robbing girls of an education. And I wanted him to see me as an example so that he can see that, you know what, girls can do something if they're allowed to go to school and get that education. So when you ask that question, I think that women's leadership is very important, yes, but girls' leadership is also just as equally, and if not even more important in this area.
That's amazing. And if I may ask a follow-up question, Zuriel. So you say girls' education is really dependent on girls' representation when it comes to advocating for topics like these. What advice would you have for a young girl like yourself who's starting out and would want to make the change that you're making right now?
I think, honestly, the biggest thing is you have to have a passion for it. I mean, when you look at girls, the reason why they make some of the best advocates is because they're experiencing it themselves, you know? If you have a grown man or a grown woman up on stage talking about it, they can talk about the issue, but it wouldn't resonate with people as much if you had a girl who was facing that exact same issue on the stage talking about it, or at least a girl who's like all the other girls who are facing similar issues. I think the biggest thing is if it's something that you're going through or you see others like you going through and you're passionate about it, you have to hold on to it. Now, I'm not saying it's an easy thing. Obviously, there's a lot of challenges throughout the way, but if it's something that you're passionate about, then you can truly, really make a difference.
Absolutely. Thanks, Zuriel. Now, to flip that question on its head, Sabina, what would you say men can do when it comes to playing a leadership role in achieving gender equality in education?
So I think it's a very emotional topic for me, and I get into some really, I want to talk about some really harsh truth, which girls unfortunately face. For example, if I can tell my own personal example, I was working in a very prestigious organization. It was a multinational, and I could face direct discrimination against women, right? And when I complained at the HR, I was the reply was, "Do you think that girls don't work hard enough, so that's why they face this challenge?" So this kind of thinking that we have, it needs to change. Secondly, this is, again, the lighter side of the problem. There is another harsher reality that the harassment that girls face on a daily basis, not just in workspaces, but in schools as well, which is why parents are not comfortable in sending their daughters to schools. I myself was a teacher, and I had this conversation with my students who were sixth grade girls, and I was surprised to learn that almost every one of them had faced this issue. And then I was more surprised when that Me Too campaign started, and almost everyone across the globe had faced this issue. And it wasn't, so I think, again, a myth that it's maybe an issue with people who are not educated or who are illiterate. Those are the ones who engage in these things. I think that's, again, an incorrect representation. Secondly, currently, even in 21st century, majority of your leadership positions are occupied by men, right? And so I think what we need to realize is that the harsh truth is that probably men need to cede their position of power to give that space to women to actually come forward. We still celebrate when a woman takes a position of leadership. We don't do that when a man does that, right? Because it's an anomaly, even now. So that's where you realize that there are so many initiatives. We claim to be the most educated civilization since the beginning, right? But still, when you look at numbers and when you look at what's happening, you unfortunately sometimes you do get hopeless of what's happening, what's wrong with the society. So I think there's we talk about many solutions. We talk that we need to collaborate, we need to make these spaces, but you need to take some really harsh steps in order to reach that goal, which is that you need to leave that space or carve that space for females in order for them to actually, and you also need to recognize the challenges that females face. Specifically, if we're talking about workspaces, there are, like, traditionally, especially for example, in developing countries, it's expected from a female to raise a family, like she is responsible for it. But at the same time, she's also expected to excel at work. Long hours are considered a good thing at workplaces, right? So these kind of things, discrimination starts from there, and people don't realize that even now. So probably these kind of things, we need to take extra steps to eliminate that.
Absolutely. So if I understand it correctly, just to repeat it back to you, when it comes to empowering women and girls' education, it's also about educating men about their privilege and the role they have to play when it comes to educating young girls. What would you say are some tangible steps, apart from workplace education and equality at the workplace, on a younger level for younger groups? What are some tangible steps that can be taken by men in positions of leadership to really change the playing field at an earlier stage?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It starts from an earlier age. It starts from, let's say, primary school education, where you need to teach young boys and girls about basic human rights. I won't even call it women's rights, because it's basic human rights. And they need to not only learn, but put it into practice. You need to provide those spaces where they can actually learn to respect each other. For example, I'm not just talking about schools, even at homes, girls are expected to cook, and men are expected to just sit and have food. So these kind of small things, they need to change, right? From early on, if there should be equality, there should be an environment of equality enforced by both teachers and parents. So I think once it should become a part of your daily life. It shouldn't be like, I'm doing a great job giving her the space. No, that should be the norm. So yeah.
Absolutely. Well, that begs the question of, we play a role in society, but what role does society play in framing us? So we're going to flip the narrative a little bit, and we're going to talk about the systems that influence us. And Zuriel, I have a question for you, actually. When it comes to education, and especially girls' education, we are bound by frameworks and by institutions that have been there for a long time. How can teaching be transformed to improve learning and to foster girls' education?
I think, so one of the things that my Dususi Foundation focuses on is alternative education. So when you go into a classroom, you learn all the typical subjects. You have math, science, history, etc. But what alternative education is it's skills that you wouldn't necessarily learn in the classroom, but you can use them to empower yourself through opportunities or through employment. When I was 13, I started a basic filmmaking workshop for out-of-school and unemployed youth. I started this in 2016, and I first launched it in Namibia. Now, as a filmmaker myself, I was self-taught in how to manage a camera, how to edit, and all those types of things. So I truly believe that others could learn this skill without having to wait until university or to film school. So I started this in Namibia, and then just 9 months after this first filmmaking workshop, one of the girls, she went out, took the skills that she learned, she borrowed a camera, and actually made her first documentary. And she got to shop it around to local TV networks in her region as well. And it's from this success story that I've now done this workshop for over 480 students, I think about now, in countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Ethiopia, Mexico, and Cote d'Ivoire. So what this shows is that alternative education, and it's not just filmmaking, it can be things like coding, engineering, entrepreneurial courses, but alternative education is important to incorporate into schools because it allows girls to explore and grow in different fields and different paths, and that can maybe lead to employment, or it can empower them and encourage them to become leaders. And when they become leaders, they can then go out and empower and encourage other girls and women. They can do that first by being a role model, but then also by creating circumstances that could help generate change.
When it comes to generating change, there's always pushback. In your experience working with over 450 girls, what are some of the challenges that you've faced and from people in changing that paradigm of empowering girls?
Well, I think, and this is something that I've seen through my education projects, through speaking with world leaders, through speaking to students in schools, there are certain reasons, like the same reasons you would find in different countries and different cultures. There's cultural reasons, there's societal reasons, there's economic reasons, there's varying reasons as to why traditionally girls aren't allowed to go to school. So sometimes there's lack of resources. When there's lack of resources, parents would look and say, boys, you go to school, girls, you stay at home and you help at the home and you do things like that. I think an important thing, and this goes back to what we talked about early on in the first couple of questions, is changing the narrative. They need to see girls and women in positions of power and leadership positions. I mean, Sabina talked about it, how in most leadership positions you have, let's say it's like 80% men, for example, 20% women. Men have the majority, so if you have to go into a board meeting and vote about something on girls' education, the majority are already men. And unless they know and understand the issue of girls' education and can see why it's so important to let their girls go to school, then it tends to tip towards their side and in their favor. So I think the biggest thing is still changing that narrative and showing the things that girls can accomplish.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zuriel. So now a question for both of you. You know, we're almost at the end of the session, so in the interest of time, I'll ask it. Where do you see the future of girls' education heading? And what are some of the things that people who want to play a part in changing that, what are some of the things that they can do?
I think for me, when I think of the future of education, my mind goes to online learning and online education. What this past year has shown us is that online learning on a large scale is very, very possible. And we can take advantage of this tried and tested method and target areas that had little to no access to education before. A few years ago, I started this small program called Dream Up, Speak Up, Stand Up. And the aim was to get as many out-of-school girls, at the time it was focused on the African continent, back into school. But then in order to make this a reality, I prioritized and focused on a couple of key things. The first was hardware. You're going to need hardware that you can lend out and allow students to use. Then you're also going to need human resources that you can lean on because they're going to be the ones who are on the ground helping the students. And then you're also going to need software. And software is what kind of powers the combination of all three of these things. Now, I speak from mostly experience on the African continent. That's where a lot of my girls' education interventions has been focused on. But when you look at the continent, they have local companies like, for example, Xerox. It's a major hardware company. They can provide things like computers to schools, to rural areas, to allow students to have access to that hardware, to allow them to get into an online learning program and access their education. Then they have software companies like SoftTribe. Just like Intel, they can create software programs on which online education programs are built upon so that students can use that to advance their learning. Then there's also human resources, and there's so many major organizations out there, one of them being the Peace Corps, for example, and they can lend out human resources when they can transfer their expertise and their skills to different countries on the African continent. I actually met with the director of Peace Corps to discuss this issue, and basically what we've looked at is this general model. There's different companies and local companies in Latin America, Asia that can take this model and do the exact same thing there. But what we've seen is through this, as long as you have that hardware, that software, and then human resources, like through Peace Corps, for example, who are helping drive the process and also transferring their skills to local volunteers, then you can use this to kind of create the future of education. Online learning is something that we've seen this last year. Not everyone has experienced it, but we've seen that it is indeed possible. And so that's where I think the future of education is.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zuriel. Sabina, what about you? You've been on the ground in Pakistan. You've worked with Taleemabad. What are some of the trends that you're seeing when it comes to girls' education?
So I think like Zuriel mentioned that online education is working. It is the future. We've all seen it. And sometimes we don't really have a choice. We have to do it. But I feel, I think you don't really have to come up with an answer, because if you think about it, it's there, right? The issue is there. There are out-of-school girls, and you need to bring them to school. And again, you can be creative about it. It doesn't have to be a typical physical school, but that's the issue. And I believe that the solutions are not that like novel, that we can't achieve them. We're like Facebook is making metaverse now. Why can't we solve this solution already, right? I think it's the harsh reality is it's not our priority, even though we say it is. It's not, because if it is, then it's not if we there are, let's say, 1% of the wealth. Sorry, I'm going into equality because that's really
Love it.
I'm really focused on that. If there's so much wealth concentrated in the hands of a few people, and if only that wealth can be distributed equally, only if you focus on girls' education, it can be solved. Solutions can be made. It's just that you just need to accept that, I guess.
So it's actually not a priority then, and
Yeah.
it has to become one, even though we say it is. It's not. Are there any other thoughts or things that you want to share with our audience about girls' education?
Well, I can go first if you want. I think girls' education, I know the title of our session is From a Priority to a Reality. I mean, the fact that we're still having these conversations shows us that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in the area of girls' education. But what I'm hoping is that through these conversations, and hopefully we'll have fewer and fewer in the future because this becomes less of an issue, I'm hoping that we can all take these ideas and actually act on them as well. You know, it's not enough to come here, sit, talk about it, smile for the camera, and then all just go home and hope that the issue gets solved. We have to take what we've learned from here, act on it, so that way we can go from girls' education from priority to a reality.
Amazing. Thank you. Sabina, go ahead.
No, I think we've discussed a lot of ideas. I think Zuriel is doing some wonderful work. She's also done filmmaking in the same subject, and that's what I was talking to her about, that maybe the new things we need to explore. We need to be creative about how we create content for girls. It's if for example, if the issue is that you can't get out of your home, then provide content at their home. You have enough technology to make that environment for girls. So it's, again, I would say that it's about recognizing that and making it a priority. I would say that seeing a lot of problems that is right in front of me, especially in my country, would say it should be a state of emergency across all levels of leadership until you solve this problem, which should have been solved already, but sadly it's not.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, ladies. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts and your experience with us. For anyone who wants to continue the conversation, please do find both Zuriel and Sabina on the Wise Connect app. And remember, learning is a journey, and we're all a part of it, and appreciate you being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.